And it's an absolute pleasure and delight to be with you here today. And just a big thank you to Alistair and the team at CMAC for inviting me up. I was thinking as I prepared to visit that I think the last time I was here, Her Majesty the Queen was opening the Technology Innovation Centre, and we had a very nice tour and lunch. Although you still owe me a picture for my mum with the Queen, so we need to follow up on that. But no, I'm joking. But no, seriously, it's an absolute delight to be back in the Technology Innovation Centre and to see, by all accounts, what looks to be a really thriving research community and making real impact. So a real credit to the leadership of CMAC to see what you've done here. As Massimo introduced, I work at GSK. I should say that, of course, I am representing GSK, and I will act accordingly. But I should probably warn you that the views that I'm going to express in the presentation today are more my own personal views rather than any consensus view coming out of GSK. But yeah, I'm sure I'll get lots of comeback when I get back to my company because this is all going to get posted on YouTube, of course, but I won't say anything too contentious. So as Massimo said, I'd like to spend a bit of time with this idea of exploiting technology to reimagine CMC outcomes. And I think what I'm hoping to do here is, certainly for my fellow industrialists, academics, I'm hoping to kind of provoke you a little bit around the thinking around this. To the students, hopefully you'll learn something, but maybe I'll settle if I just keep you entertained. But no, I think I hope we have a really good exploration of this interesting topic. And I should say I come to this topic with quite an interesting background. So as Massimo, you probably gathered from Massimo, I spent the first 10 years of my career, or roughly half of my career, in CMC process development, tech transfer, scale-up of both drug substance and drug product modalities across large molecules and small molecules, and did quite a lot of lab automation type techniques in both R&D and manufacturing. And then in the latter part of my career, I've moved into the IT function. I could hear lots of hissing and sort of booing coming from the audience. But so I made a transition into GSK's IT organization. And that's given me an opportunity to look at this from the other side. Now, I should say that in a company like GSK, especially in the R&D and manufacturing domains, moving into the IT function isn't as scary as it sounds, because really I spend most of my day very much focused on IT systems and applications that support our scientific and our manufacturing operations. So it's still a very kind of technical role, as opposed to what you might traditionally think of IT in terms of HR systems and business systems and all the rest of it. So let me move on to that. And as I was preparing for this, I had a bit of a reflection on my last 20 years in the industry. And certainly my fellow industrialists, and probably some of the academics as well, will chuckle as they look at this little journey. Now, you'll have to forgive me. This is my perspective, and the exact positioning on the timeline of these various technologies and ways of working are maybe not precise, right? And could certainly have played out differently in other companies. But broadly speaking, I think you can see a nice evolution here, which I hope most people will recognize. And the bit I'm interested in is this idea of how ways of working, CMC ways of working, and CMC technologies that you use to drive those ways of working, I'm really interested in how those two things intertwine and evolve, right? Now, I have to say, one of my traits is I'm a pragmatist, right? So I tend to sit in the middle of this line here. And what I mean by that is you have some people who are adamant that actually you have to redefine ways of working, and then you go and find technology and you drive that way, so it very much drives down. There are others who are technologists who take the different paradigm view, and they sit at the bottom and they say, no, new technologies drive different ways of working. And I have to admit, my experience in 20 years, it's a bit of both, right? It intertwines. Sometimes new technology precipitates a new way of working. Sometimes the new way of working precipitates a need to find technology. Now, I thought it was interesting to have a look at this. So I joined the industry in 2002. And I think quite similar to most companies like Pfizer and GSK, most of the big pharma companies, Novartis, etc., there was in the very early 2000s, there was a big wave of the introduction of engineering disciplines into pharmaceutical product development. Traditionally, before that, it had been a very kind of chemistry-orientated type sector. And I think I'm sure I'm amongst friends in an engineering community here, but the joke of the chemist doing scale-up and they've got this massive round-bottom flask that they walk into the factory. I don't know if that cartoon still does the rounds in engineering faculties, but certainly when I joined, that was the joke. Scale-up was really just a bigger round-bottom flask. And then you move through this, and the first thing that started to happen is we started to have this concept of design for manufacture, which I'm sure many people remember. And at the same time as the workflows, the ways of working, so introducing some of the engineering discipline into product development, at the same time we started to get into things like design of experiment software. We started to see modeling software, so applications like Aspen Tech, what was the other one called? MATLAB. There's all those sorts of applications started to become available. Of course, PSE comes later. Where's the speaker? Yeah, so I should give a plug to PSE. That comes later along in the trajectory, but certainly there as well, right, in terms of the introduction of modeling software. And then that led to a change of ways of working, right? So because we had the modeling systems, because we had the engineering disciplines, we started to get into process modeling and simulation in the sort of the early 2000s. We then also started to get into process design software, and then, of course, we got into quality by design, right? This was a big paradigm shift in terms of ways of working. And I remember the strap line from the FDA on this was, we want to start designing quality into pharmaceutical products, not testing quality. And that was the big kind of paradigm mindset shift. And that was very much supported by new ways of working around process analytical technologies. And then on the IT side, if you like, the technology side, we started to get into things like electronic notebooks. They started to roll out. So, I don't know if students still use paper lab notebooks. Do they use paper lab notebooks, or do they use electronic notebooks in TRC? Yeah. Well, when I joined at GSK, you got given a big orange notebook, and you did your experiments. And I think somewhere in the archives of GSK, there's about 20 lab notebooks with my name on the front where I did all my experimentation. Well, no more, right? So you work in electronic notebook environments. We also started to get into things like what I would call Excel macro-based laboratory execution systems and scientific data management systems, right? So very much taking the sort of the Microsoft Excel environment and then codifying a lot of functionality to manage laboratory workflows in the testing labs. At the same time, though, on the ways of working, we started to see the introduction of laboratory automation. So the first kind of parallel reactor systems started to come in. And then obviously that started to really challenge the Excel-based approach to managing all of that. And certainly, I remember having parallel automation systems where you'd have a lab PC, and it would suddenly start generating huge amounts of data files, and they would sit on the lab PC, and then you'd have to, you'd take a memory stick, and you'd have to transfer. Yeah, there we go. Paul Sharrett remembers it well. You'd transfer it across into your desk-based PC and all that kind of thing. So we started to realize that we needed to get much better at our laboratory execution systems. We started to introduce more sophisticated PAT systems, sample management systems. And then if you dial back up into the ways of working, that then complemented with this idea of getting into, sorry, I should say we're into about the 2010s now. We started to get into in silico product design. We started to get into things like advanced manufacturing, and particularly continuous manufacturing. And certainly this is, it's around here that we get into the birth of CMAC and what happened on that side. We then started to get into the initial kind of digital twin ideas, product lifecycle management. On the IT side, we started to talk about high-performance compute and the opportunity to use high-performance compute to drive some of our in silico design. Moving right up to date to today, so ways of working. I work in the vaccines division. I couldn't help but put messenger RNA-based vaccines platforms on there. That's a huge disruption in terms of ways of working, a very different modality for delivering vaccines compared to what we do with antigen-based vaccines. Again, on the technology side, we get into sort of on-prem traditional data platforms. And then we move into this really interesting period, which is where do we go next, right? Now, I would be a fool to try and imagine too much of that, but I think certainly what we see is advanced robotics, and certainly yesterday we heard about the work that CMAC are doing on robotics, and so we got a taste of that. Interestingly enough, we start getting this idea of cloud laboratory, and there's already companies out there that will offer this for you. So effectively, from a scientist's perspective, for all intents and purposes, your laboratory where you do your experiments is cloud-based. Now, it's not actually cloud-based. It's, this is the amazing paradigm of cloud. It's not actually in the cloud. It's just someone else's data center or someone else's facility, but you access it via the cloud and the internet. And also, we heard a little bit about virtual reality systems, this idea of cloud-based data fabrics and streaming of data. And then I think we also heard yesterday on one of the presentations, I remember they were talking about this idea of closed-loop automated development, right? So can the robotic solutions take their own decisions and drive development? And certainly on the technology side, we start to see this addition of cognitive automation. Now, hopefully what you've taken from this is this really interesting kind of interplay between how we work in CMC and the technology that we use to do it, and which drives which way around is kind of an interesting piece. And this is what I want to explore with you guys for the next couple of minutes. Now, there's a challenge on this, and I wanted to introduce this concept to you, which is there are three fundamental ways to apply technology to a process, in my view, anyway. Now, first of all, let's talk about process. Let me set the framework up first of all. So, by process, I mean you have a starting point, you're trying to achieve an outcome. In this case, today, we're talking about a CMC process, and that could be any process. It could be anything from a sub-process, which might be reaction crystal optimizations, filtration studies, all the way to some of the big CMC outcomes, things like the CMC section of a regulatory file or a tech transfer package, right? All those processes. Now, from an industry perspective, I'll probably get in trouble on this, but there's basically two attributes that we really care about, right? One is the cost, and the other one is how long it takes you, right? Now you might say, well, what about compliance and data integrity and all the rest of it? And I go, yeah, but basically, if you have poor reliability in the process, basically that just drives the cost up and drives the time up because you have to repeat the process again, right? So in the end of the day, it basically drills down to how much does it cost you to achieve the outcome you're trying to get and how long does it take you? That's the bottom line, right? Now, when you look at that process and you think about the adoption of technology, you've basically got three fundamental ways to change it. You can digitize it, you can reinvent it, or you can disrupt it. And I think my thesis for you today is that most companies struggle to go beyond digitize. By the way, GSK included. I'm not claiming any moral high ground here. It is really challenging to go beyond just digitizing that process. But the problem is the true value is when you can do the reinvention and the disruption, if you can identify it. So what do I mean by this? Well, I wanted to explain this a bit more. So what do I mean by digitization? So the way you can think about digitization is effectively you have the same workflow, the same process, you're trying to get the same outcome, but you're basically applying digital technology to digitize it, to make it electronic, right? So this could be removing paper, that type of idea. And there's no doubt you can absolutely get some return on investment from a digitization strategy. You can make it go faster and you can make the cost go down. But what you find is that for a brownfield investment, and I think I was talking to Dave last night over dinner on this, what I mean by a brownfield investment is if you already have the workflow established and you already have the people doing the workflow and the workflow works quite well, actually just applying a digitization strategy to it, it's very hard to make the business case stick. You get some incremental improvement in time and cycle time, in cost and cycle time, but actually it's hard. So what you find with just straight digitization approaches is it's much easier to achieve if you're targeting a sort of a greenfield type deployment. So by all means, if you're introducing a new site or a new laboratory, or moving a workflow to a new place, then by all means digitize it whilst you do it, because your minds will get the advantages. But if you're already doing those processes, it's actually very difficult. So what do we mean by digital reinvention? Well, digital reinvention in my vernacular basically means, look, you're targeting the same outcome, right? So the output's going to be the same thing. You're going to have an optimized reaction. You're going to have a tech transfer package. But the way you achieve that is taking a different path, right? It's a fundamental different way of working. And the important point is that that different way of working is enabled by the technology, right? And in a way that you couldn't achieve if you didn't deploy the technology, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by this, but I thought there was a great example, and sorry, this is just a trivial observation, but it just gives you a little insight into the thinking on this. Do you remember yesterday we had the presentation about the robot? You remember the robot moved backwards and forwards across the lab, right? So an example of this is in a way, it's still constrained by the fact that a human would walk across the room in 2 dimensions, right, and spin around and move the lab. And I was watching it, I immediately thought, yeah, so a reinvention would be to say, well, actually, why don't we stack the equipment vertically? Because actually a robot doesn't care about moving up and down, right? You can put it on one of those, those cherry picker robots. It can just stay in the same place and move the sample up, right? And that's a little example of if you reconfigure that workflow to work at a vertical plane, you would get away with a robot moving around in a 2-dimension. The reason why we're constrained in 2 dimensions is we're still thinking about the human lab technician walking around on a flat floor, right? So that's a trivial example of what I mean by this. And then I think the other one that's interesting is when you get into disruption. And what I mean by disruption is actually you now start to think about, well, maybe there's a different outcome, right? So maybe we want an optimized chemical reaction, but maybe our conception of what that output looks like is going to be fundamentally different. And importantly, it's different in a way that's only enabled through a different digital workflow. And I think if you look at this value curve, and this is qualitative, but you get the idea. The real value comes if you can start to adopt technology and drive towards this reinvention and this disruption area. And I think the challenges, and I discovered this certainly when I moved from my R&D and manufacturing roles into the IT function, the challenge is a lot of companies are stuck in a sort of a 90-10-0 paradigm where they're spending 90% of their investment digitizing. They're only managing to find 10% of the investment that's truly reinventing, and they're almost doing no digital disruption. And the challenge is, how do you move it to some new paradigm? Now, we can argue about the percentages, but the basic idea is, can you constrain the straight digitization? Can you radically ramp up the level of investment that's true digital reinvention and save a bit of money in case you find a good disruption opportunity? That's the basic idea, right? And I think that's the challenge for most companies that have a sort of a digital transformation agenda. So you're all a technical community, so I thought a little worked example of this might be interesting to make this point. So this is imagine this is a sort of a design space for a process, and let's call it a reaction. Let's stay with kind of a sort of chemical reaction, right? So imagine this is the surface, the reaction output surface. And as you move around this surface, you're changing all the different parameters, right? So concentration, stoichiometry, catalysts, whatever, solvents. And now, when I first started in this industry, and I'm sure many people remember this, you did random walk, right? So you started here, your project manager said, Mark, we need this impurity optimized, and you'd go, okay, and you'd think about it, you'd look at the structures, and you'd sort of surmise, well, maybe if I move a little bit over here, that might represent decreasing temperature. Okay, that got a little bit better. And then you'd think, well, maybe there's too much catalyst in here, so then you'd move up here a bit, and you'd kind of walk your way using your intuition. You'd sort of sniff out the optimum place to be, right? And, don't knock it, it kind of worked, right? So people got very good at this. There was a real skill to optimizing chemical reactions, and you'd get to your optimum state. Now, what we then saw was the introduction of automation, so parallel experimentation, right? These kind of parallel reactor rigs where you could leave a set of reactions going overnight. And I remember doing this, so you get the same problem. You're told to optimize it, and of course I would go, well, I'm a chemical engineer, I like to think linearly, so you'd say, right, let's see what happens to this chemical reaction if I vary temperatures by 5 degrees in 5-degree increments, right? So you'd do an experiment from 20 to 40 degrees, you'd stick it in the parallel experimentation, you'd come back in the morning, and you'd discover, yeah, okay, that's the good spot to be. And then you'd think, well, I'm still not where I need to be, so maybe I should vary something else. Maybe I'll look at solvent volumes. And again, you'd use the parallel experimentation again, and you'd do a whole bunch of solvent volumes, right? And then eventually you'd get to your optimum place, and you'd kind of optimize, right? So that was the introduction of lab automation. But then, remember on that first slide I showed you, what happened there is we started to introduce this idea of design of experiments, right? And again, it took a while for the way of working to shift, right? But the way it works today, and I hope this is what you teach them all, right? The way it works today is you don't try and do this. You definitely don't try and do this. What you do is you say, right, let's do a design of experiments. And the aim of the design of experiments is not to try and get the exact react conditions. The aim of the design of experiments is to explore the reaction space at extremes. So this would be your high-low on, in this case, it's just a 2-variable sort of design of experiments. You could do more sophisticated designs. But you'd effectively explore the ranges of the design space. You'd do 3 repeats at the center point, which would give you a sense of the variability of the system. And then based on that, you would build a statistical model, and the statistical model would tell you, actually, these are the optimum reaction conditions. And then you might do a confirmatory experiment at the end just to make sure that the whole thing worked. But the theory was that would have worked. So that's an interesting example for you of what I mean by kind of digitize and then reinvent, right, is a little bit of a trivial example. And it's hard to do. And I guess the question I think about is it's all very well for me to look back on 20 years, but I was in industry when we were doing this, and it never occurred to me to do that straight away, right? So I had to work my way through as a practicing chemical engineer. I had to work my way through as we adopted different ways of working. We adopted different technologies. So what is this CMC Digital Challenge? And this is a slide that a colleague of mine at GSK put together, which I really like, which is what he calls this adoption burden, right? So today what we have is you have a whole lot of existing processes, right? And most of them are either paper on glass or quite kind of document-centric, right? And what we have is we have digital solutions. And the challenge is that you're essentially layering technology on top of old process. So you don't change the process, you adopt technology, but you just layer it on top. And you end up going after symptoms rather than going after root causes, and you get a very siloed approach. Now, the alternative to this is this digital transformation idea where you really generate some value creation, right? And the idea here is you re-engineer your process, and you put your digital platform or your digital solution right at the heart of the way of working, and you re-engineer it. In this case, you get much more business outcome focused, you solve your root causes, it's much more holistic, and you get a much better return on investment. Now, why is this so hard? You're probably looking at this thinking, well, this is obvious. I mean, surely this is what you can do. But trust me, this is really difficult. And I'll give you two little snapshots of why this is so difficult. Large corporations are incredibly good at running their processes, right? To give you an example, GSK, in the vaccines division, we release 8,000 batches of vaccine batch a year, right? 8,000. I worked it out. That's about 1 an hour. So the machine, which is all those existing processes, as much as you might criticize them, they work, and they work really efficiently, right? Another way to think about it is in GSK, we're very proud of the fact that our vaccines division, 40% of the world's children will receive a GSK vaccine in their childhood, right? And that's an incredible reach. Think about that. We have a machine based on these processes that touches 40% of the world's children, right? That's an incredible reach. So it's not a trivial task to interfere with that process that basically works and introduce new digital solutions. Now, I said I wanted to think a little bit about the CMC outcomes. At least in my thinking, at a very high level, there are 4 things that CMC is trying to do. The first thing it's trying to do is design a medicine, right? So that includes both the chemical entity or the biological entity, put it into some sort of formulation, the packaging, that whole design piece, right? That's one of the outcomes that CMC is trying to drive at. The other one is we actually need to manufacture some of that medicine for clinical supplies to get through our clinical trial process. Because remember, for commercial supply, that's done by the manufacturing organization. So very much thinking in a CMC space, you need to generate clinical supplies to get to that point where you have a medicine. You need to generate a regulatory file to allow you to get approval to launch the medicine. And the fourth outcome is you need to tech transfer that to our manufacturing colleagues so that they can actually make this. Now, I think the medicine design and clinical supplies is another lecture in its own right, and I kind of figured to this audience we are we've already seen some of this already in the GPROMS talk. Medicine design, we have things like ADOPT. I think our colleagues at Pfizer were the initiated that. We were really looking at that kind of in silico approach to medicines design, and again, that's an example of transforming that way of working around how we design medicines. Clinical supplies, I don't need to come to CMAC and lecture you about that. We all know, and we've got the Medicines Manufacturing Innovation Center just down the road, really looking to transform, not just clinical supplies, also commercial manufacturing, but certainly also looking to see how we can use continuous to optimize clinical supply, some of the packaging innovations that I know that they're interested in the MOIC. The two that I thought haven't been touched, and what I wanted to talk a little bit more about today, is one is the regulatory file and the other is the tech transfer package. And I think those are 2 areas that are, in my opinion, really ripe for some disruption and some rethinking. So let me start with the regulatory file. So to those of you uninducted in the joys of pharmaceutical product development, I found a good paper here, quite recent, 2020, which describes the regulatory process in quite a nice kind of generic way. It also talks about this idea of a structured data management solution, which I think is what I want to talk about a little bit. So certainly refer you to this paper for a good introduction here. But basically, what you do in the regulatory submission process is you run experiments, you generate outputs, you generate a whole lot of internal documents and reports. You generate some formal technical reports, some PQS documentation, and then you put a file together, right, a regulatory filing. And actually the file is very specific to the region. So you file it for the US, you file it for the EU, you file it for Japan, you file it all over the place. And so what you end up with is a core dossier, which is kind of a document, and then you end up with these sort of slightly customized versions of the core dossier for each of the different regions. Now, the FDA has been doing some quite interesting work on this, and I wanted to refer you again to a great paper from 2019. I think this is the first paper where they published this idea of what they call this knowledge-aided assessment and structured application, CASA, they seem to have labeled it. And there's a great paper here by you which describes exactly what they're talking about. But essentially what they're doing is taking a structured application. So structured application is that dossier I showed you, right? So effectively you have what's called a CTD. That comes in. And then what they wanted to do is they wanted to put a digital platform in place, or they would like to put a digital platform in place to allow the assessor, who has to review the file, to do it in a more digital way and actually get consistency and knowledge management to allow them to sort of look transversely across different companies' applications, right? So that's what this whole CASA platform is about. But now what's interesting is industry don't submit directly into CASA, right? What industry do is we still submit our file, right? Which is, and when I say file, I mean it's generated in a Word document, it's PDF'd, it's text and tables, etc. It's what I call semi-structured, right? It's then transcribed into this CASA platform. And you can see where I'm going with this, because if we go back to that little model I showed you, effectively what we're doing, and this is a little bit provocative, but I'll see what my fellow industrialists think, is effectively what we're doing is, in industry, we're piling in with digital solutions. We're then still transcribing them into the old paper-based approach. We're sharing them with our regulatory colleagues, and they are then transcribing them back into a digital solution. And when you look at it like this, it's kind of obvious what the reinvention could be, right? And obviously the reinvention is to move, and this is why I gave you a reference to that paper there, move to this idea of a structured, content management regulatory system, right? And effectively what we do is re-engineer that process. And we drive this idea of a CMC data model. And actually, I think the interesting idea, and this is very much an idea, so it's my idea, and it needs to be tested. But could you move to this idea of continuous assessment and almost semi-automated approval? So my idea here is, imagine you had a cloud-based submission process. At the start of your development, you would start to populate your regulatory submission with data, and you'd almost have, in a typical IT sense, you get a little bar that tells you the percent completion, right? Imagine you just had a little bar, and basically when you get to about 95%, the FDA says, okay, we'll and actually imagine if the FDA or any other regulatory agency were constantly reviewing it, so that by the time you got to 100%, it was almost pre-approved, right? Because they've been monitoring the development of the CMC section of the file, right? And I think that would radically change our ways of working. So I wanted to talk about tech transfer a little bit, which is another really critical process in the CMC space, and certainly, as a professional in industry working in CMC, the most exciting thing you do is CMC tech transfers, right? The opportunity to take your lab scale work, scale it up, deploy it into a factory, and then the satisfaction you get from actually seeing drug substance in large kegs or drug product coming off a tableting line and then seeing that going out and touching a patient. That is, if you're in this industry, it's got to be one of the most exciting things you can do and one of the most rewarding things you can do. Now again, going back to that model I shared with you, I've already talked to you about how on the CMC space we're putting in digital solutions, so ELN systems, SDMS systems, PAT systems, all the rest of it. And on the manufacturing side, we certainly are deploying manufacturing execution systems. We've got all the automation layers. We have laboratory execution systems doing the quality control type piece. What is interesting, and I'd love to hear from some of my colleagues in other big pharma companies, is, and I did check this actually, because I've been a bit out of touch from when I last did a tech transfer, but interesting enough, GSK still prescribes 44 required documents associated with tech transfer. And in fact, some of them are even required in hard copy with a wet signature, which is kind of interesting, right? So you think of 20 years, right? I was tempted to say earlier on that a lot has changed, but actually a lot hasn't changed, right? And that is quite kind of interesting. And we heard a little bit about digital twin. Now, I must admit, I'm a chemical engineer by background, as I'm sure many people in here are. I am slightly frustrated how, as a discipline, we allowed someone to hijack systems modeling and call it digital twins and sort of take it away from us, because honestly, it's just modeling, right? It is just modeling. It's more complicated modeling, I get that, and it involves this idea of hybrid modeling. But basically, digital twins are just models, right? They're just big interacting models, but just done on a much bigger scale and powered by compute, really. And actually, I think one of the harsh realities is it can be quite difficult. We often get into some discussions. So certainly from an academic perspective and R&D perspective, I think what I often find is people get very excited about creating the digital twin to describe a process. And don't get me wrong, I've been in R&D. In a way, creating a good digital twin for a process, it is the ultimate exemplification of process understanding, right? It does demonstrate that you really understand the system. The interesting point, though, is what utility does it have in terms of adopting it in a sort of a commercial manufacturing perspective, right? So to give you a little example, imagine you've got a digital twin for a chemical reaction, and you turn up to head of manufacturing and you say, oh, here's our digital twin, this will help you run the process. I can tell you right now, manufacturing guys are really hard-nosed. All they want to know is, does it increase my yield? Does it cut my cost? Does it make me allowed to do any faster? And if you say, well, no, because we've already optimized it using the digital twin, it should be fine, then basically say, thank you very much, put it on the shelf, right? They don't want to run a digital twin live, because in a commercial manufacturing perspective, a digital twin is a cost, right? It has to run, it has to be sitting in cloud, it has to be running, it has to have PAC instruments feeding it, and we don't want it just sitting there unless it's giving real-time value. So one of the ideas I've had is, if you look at this challenge that I talked about, where you've got all this documentation, to my mind, no one's really thinking about the application of digital twin to replace this, right? What if we actually made digital twin, rather than seeing it as an add-on, right? So today what you do is a tech transfer process, and then there's you have a 3-day tech transfer meeting, and then the last day, some poor sod comes in and tries to talk about his digital twin modeling work, right? And it's very much just a sort of tacked on to the end of the agenda. What if we actually put the digital twin at the heart of it? What if the digital twin was the way in which manufacturing and R&D talk about what's been done in development and understand the process, right? That would be a radical shift and paradigm shift in terms of how we work. It would drive a lot of change into this area. It would drive a lot of change into the laboratories in terms of why you're doing the different work. And I think you could really reinvent the ways of working for tech transfer if you had a different attitude towards this digital twin. And certainly at GSK, that idea is getting some traction. I did say I was representing my own view rather than a consensus view, but this is a slide that a colleague of mine generated, which just shows a little bit some of that thinking. So this idea of predict first, using automation, this idea of data storage, it's supported by PAT across the R&D and manufacturing divide, and then you very much got this digital twin that's playing a key role in that tech transfer partnership, giving you simulation capability and then giving you data-driven modeling, and also some real-time kind of control and optimization capability. So really what I'm suggesting from a tech transfer perspective is let's reimagine how our CMC development digital systems and our manufacturing systems interact with each other and exchange information, and let's put a digital twin at the heart of it. And I think the ambition for me would be this idea of a paperless tech transfer, and by paperless I include you can't cheat with paper on glass, right? So I mean true paperless tech transfer ways of working. You could get incredible data traceability to source systems and remove manual transcription. I remember I did a visit to Rolls-Royce, and we were hosted by Haban Mughal, who's one of their technology people. And I remember we were looking at the Trent, Trent 500 or Trent 1000 or whatever, the big engines, the big new engine they'd produced. And we were on the factory floor looking at the machining of a turbine blade. And I was originally a metallurgist by training, and I remember Hamid explained to me that these turbines, and I don't know if any of you are flying soon, but this is not going to be very reassuring, but those turbine blades, they operate, I wish I could remember the exact figure, but they operate well outside their melting point. Right, so think about that for a second. The turbine blade is at a temperature that is higher than its melting point, the alloy melting point, right? And I was like, well, how does that work? And effectively, they drill really tiny, like little micro needle type holes through the turbine blade to allow for like a cooling effect, and basically allow the bottom line is they allow those turbine blades to operate at a way outside their normal temperature range for the alloy, which is extraordinary. But anyway, the reason I tell you that story is we were on the factory floor looking at a lathe machine, and the person demonstrated that they had traceability of the lathe parameters all the way back to their development labs. And I remember the comment to myself, and I was with a colleague from GSK, a senior manufacturing colleague, and they said, "Oh, but of course you make medicines which are much more important, so this should be like very basic compared to what you guys do." And we sort of looked at each other and decided not to say anything and just went, "Oh yes, of course." But the reality is it's all paper based, and actually the data traceability is transcription, right? We do a lot of transcription from technical reports into tech transfer packages onto manufacturing colleagues, and then down into these manufacturing systems. And then to really crown it off, imagine we could reimagine this idea of combining what I've talked about from a ways of working for tech transfer with that regulatory submission process. So imagine we could integrate with a structured content management regulatory system to remove transcription into the regulatory submission. So not only do you use that digital twin to create a tech transfer package, but you might also use it to populate your regulatory submission. Wow. I mean, can you imagine? We can imagine what the world would look like if we could get all that right. Now, the last thing I wanted to close with before we get into some questions is I did want to talk a little bit about computer systems validation. And as I said to you, I work in an IT function now, and this is probably one of the biggest shocks to my system was the way in which we do software testing. And I think, and I'm going to talk about this idea of quality. Now, when I talk about quality here, I don't mean quality in the kind of the sort of quality by design sense in the medicines quality. I'm really talking about the quality of the IT system. I'm really talking about the bugs, right? To what extent do software systems have flaws and bugs when you deploy them into the production environment? And we have a really impressive testing paradigm in the IT sector. So there's a whole lot of testing. So you get requirements testing, you get unit testing, informal testing, which is what I call kind of kick the tires testing. You get regression testing to make sure that nothing that previously worked now stops working. And then ultimately you get this kind of user acceptance testing. So what you can see by this is that we are very much locked into achieving quality in an IT system through testing. We basically test it in, right? And actually, interestingly, paradoxically, the testing paradigm is still very much paper or paper on glass driven, right? So you generate huge quantities of PDF documents to support all that testing. The other interesting thing is it represents about 50% of the total system investment. So if any of you are in IT or trying to drive an IT investment, if you've got a £4 million investment per system, I reckon about half of it's probably just driving this testing, right? And in fact, and this is where it gets provocative, I would argue it adds no value whatsoever in terms of capability and functionality. Now, I do accept that we need testing to make sure it does what it's supposed to do, but it doesn't actually enhance the functionality and the value you get from the system. And here I'll ask an interesting question: does it work? Right? Does it work? How many of you have deployed an IT system or been the receiver of an IT system and had no bugs on go live? Right? It's clearly not, in my opinion, clearly not working. Right? So I think, and I've tried to discuss with some quality colleagues, I think this is analogous to the quality by design paradigm shift that we had with the regulatory agencies in the late 2000s, right? And my proposition is, can we, industry and regulators, can we change that approach, right? So can we get into a conversation and say, hey, what are we going to do about computer systems qualification and validation? Because as we digitize R&D environments for CMC and manufacturing environments for CMC, this is going to cripple us, is my opinion, right? And by the way, you have to repeat it every time you release anything, right? So every time Microsoft sends a new upgrade to something or an integration component, you have to revalidate the whole stack, right? I think it's a massive problem. Now, you can do things. You can automate it to reduce some of the manual burden. You can also automate some of the paper on glass. I was talking to a particular software vendor who commented to me that as long as you can automate the massive pile of paper for a regulatory inspection, then just leave it, and when the inspector wants to see it, you push the button and it reams out the printer and they go off and read it, right? But I mean, that's not great, is it? It's not a great solution, really. And this is the really big point I'd make, is the reality is you can never fully test out all the bugs and flaws, right? Because you just physically, well, no, I know physically is not the right word, you can't virtually, I guess is the better word, you can't digitally or virtually recreate all of the different conditions that a modern large corporate IT system is trying to cater for, right? So it is very difficult to test it in. So anyway, that's a bit of a provocation to just add on the end of this idea of reimagining workflows. So just to conclude then, so hopefully I've managed to convince you that ways of working and technology are intimately linked, and they do a nice little dance together as things evolve. I hope you've grasped this concept that there's different levels of technology exploitation, from just straight digitization through into reinvention and into full disruption. And I hope you've got a bit of a sense of what I mean by that and what some of the challenges in that are. I think there are real opportunities to reimagine all of the key outcomes for CMC. So I didn't talk about digital design of medicines. I didn't talk about some of the actual manufacturing technologies, because I think we've got that. Certainly got that very, very well covered in today. But I think there's real untapped opportunities in the regulatory processes and the tech transfer processes. And then I think the last thing I'd leave you with is, in all of that discussion, I think there's a real issue around computer systems qualification and validation that we're going to need to tackle as an industry and with our regulators. So with that, I will conclude, and very happy to have any questions.